Okay, so namaste. I'm Krishna Keshava
Namaste.
Das. This is Professor Brian Ford, and we're here to discuss Brian Ford's work in single cell biology. And my question to him is, how has his work with single cells and their cognitive and purposeful properties, how has it shaped his view about himself as an individual person?
It's a very interesting question. Of all the thousands of questions I've been asked over the decades, I've never been asked that one. But curiously, it is germane and it is present in my mind every day. If I do anything at all, I tend to think to myself, what would the cells be thinking? I mean, if, for example, you suddenly dose yourself with some new additive or some new superfood or something, I imagine the cells thinking, good Lord, what on earth is this? I've never seen this before. What shall we make of it? And by wondering what the cells make of it, you do find an answer in many respects to the value or the non-value of what it is you're putting into your system. I have always regarded myself not as a body divided up into cells at all. I regard myself as a community of cells that, rather than wasting their energies and dissipating their lives by existing as single-celled autonomous entities floating about in a pond, decide to stick together, create an internal pond, and manifest themselves as what we call human life. Medics tend to see the human body as a bag of organs with two of everything down the outside and one of everything down the middle. I don't. I regard us as a community of semi-autonomous cells. And of course, it works because I am always aware of what the cells need. And here I am, only 3.5 years from 90 years old. And so clearly, my understanding of how my body works has not done me any great harm. But yes, I do think of myself in a very different way to how everybody else in the world looks at themselves. And if my continued sprightliness is any evidence, I may be doing it right, don't you think?
Yes, but how do you account for the autonomy of the organism as a whole, making decisions as a self unto, not just as a collective, but as a whole unto itself?
The the actual coming together of what the cells do, the linking together, the formation of a network of a cohesive, an entire body, an entire organism, um, is an interesting concept because it explains one aspect of humanity that nobody ever really talks about, and that's the moment of death. Now, we all know that cells die and that parts of the body die, and that some people die earlier than others, and that parts of the body sometimes wear out sooner than other parts of the body do. But just think of it. If we were just a body as doctors imagine a body, then you might, for example, find that, I don't know, you might have problems with the arteries in your legs. So your legs might die, and then your lower abdomen might die, until eventually you had some poor person lying in the bed with almost all of them rotted away, and still the head working and saying, well, this is the only little bit that hasn't died yet. But it doesn't happen. What happens is that somebody's lying in bed, mortally ill, at the end of their lives, and quite suddenly it all stops. Quite suddenly the doctor says, time of death, 6:15. Now, it may well be that hearing might go on a little bit longer than that or something of the sort, but you do have to face one fact that I've never seen anybody actually argue before. And that is that a minute before that moment of death, every single cell in the body was alive and fully functioning. 1 minute after that moment of death, all the cells are still alive. Every cell is still functioning. There is nothing different so far as the cells are concerned before death and after death. I had a grafted cornea in my left eye. It was probably about 8 months since the person from whom it came had died. You can take a heart from a person who is brain dead, and it will stay alive for perhaps 5 or 6 hours, given the right environment. What has happened is not that anything in the body has died. The cells have not died. The cells after death are all still fully functioning and alive. What has happened is that the communion between the cells, the coordination between the cells as an organism have ceased to communicate. There is almost a moment at which the cohesion between the cells, the coordinated activity switches on. And the only way that we can explain that moment of death is by understanding that, by understanding the way that the cells which were all communicating have suddenly all, as it were, mutually agreed not to do it anymore. But after death, every cell in the human body is just as alive as it was before death, which is an extremely interesting philosophy on which to conjure.
Sure. Now, can it be seen that the communication, the harmony among cells during organismic life, the organism as a whole is a conductor of that harmony, that the orchestra of the cell, the cellular orchestra, has a conductor, the organism as a whole, which is what perpetuates the organism throughout the cellular turnover during the organism's lifetime, because, of course, as you're saying, the cells that are existing at the time of organismic death are still alive even after organismic death. But throughout, let's say, human lifetime, 80, 90 years of the organism living, there's a lot of cellular turnover where cells are born and die, but they're still being harmonized and they're being orchestrated in the same way for the organism as a whole. So that orchestrator seems to be what passes away at death. And then the harmony of the orchestra breaks down when they're no longer being orchestrated by that whole self.
I see no evidence or need for there being a conductor. The body might indeed be construed as the largest symphony orchestra ever known, with some of the players becoming old and dying, and new players coming and sliding silently into their seats and carrying on, picking up the violin and playing as though nothing had ever happened. You could imagine the body like that. But there is no need for there to be a conductor. There is a kind of an understanding amongst everybody that quite suddenly things have gone far enough and we all need to stop playing now. We just stop. That's the moment of death. No one signals it. No one dictates it. Indeed, in Victorian times, everybody carried a little bottle of smelling salts, very pungent salts, often containing things like ammonia, that you'd apply to the nostrils of somebody at the moment of death, and they would suddenly flicker their eyes and come back to life and live on a little bit. The idea was that if you can stimulate the body, it might live on for a little bit longer. No, perfectly arguable that it would. But I don't see any need for there to be a conductor. I do think, though, that harmony, as you rightly describe it, can be closely correlated with our notion of the soul. And I don't think that the soul leaves the body. I just think that the soul, that rhythmic coordination, that complete concatenation of everything coming together, I think it simply stops. It just switches off. And those cells will hand themselves over to the natural processes of degradation and recycling through microbes and fungi and others, and the body has ceased to exist. I am not persuaded that there is a spiritual soul that floats off into heaven and continues its existence. Indeed, when I was very young, I remember at church being told how people would go to heaven if they were good and followed what the priest had said. And I remember thinking to myself, well, hang on a second. We knew a man whose previous two wives had died and he just married for the third time. And I was about 7 or 8 at the time. I thought, well, what happens in heaven when this chap turns up there and there are his 3 wives, all of whom he loves very dearly? That's not going to work. And it was that single idea when I was that age that made me realize that our notion of heaven just doesn't have legs. It isn't viable. So I think that from the moment of death, when the entire body begins to slide downhill towards putrescence, that's fine. You can diagnose the moment of death retrospectively. And I remember writing about this in the Sunday Times in London, I think in 1963, well over 60 years ago, that the moment of death is really only properly assessed retrospectively. So I think there is no conductor. I think it is a huge orchestra which everybody agrees to join in order to create wonderful harmonies. But there comes a time when it's gone on for long enough, and by mutual consent, it just stops. The notion of the moment of death, rather than slow bits of the body dying and drying and dropping off, is one that we all ought to think about because there is no philosophy that addresses that conundrum, and it remains a great and intriguing puzzle.
Yes, I mean, so the fact that this almost all the cells in the body perish multiple times throughout the course of a lifetime, yet our direct experience as a human is that we have a cohesive memory of ourself, even as the details of our likes and dislikes, even the form of our body may change. Nonetheless, we have a linear memory of our self-experience over the course of that mental turnover, cellular, physical turnover. I think there is evidence that there is a unitary force which is harmonizing all that differentiation. There's a unity which is harmonizing the diversity. And then, to come in with, well, sometimes Christian ideas of heaven or ideas of heaven in other religions might not make exact sense to us. Well, that's no reason to dismiss the existence of a soul that no longer is attached to the body. From the Vedic perspective, when we talk about soul, what we mean consciousness and self-consciousness, that there is an attention of a subject on an object, and that attention of the subject, its relationship with the object of the body, is what we call life. Just how in quantum mechanics we know that the observer has to be there to collapse the wave function. There has to be attention for the actuality to emerge of the physical. And that when the attention leaves, then the actuality becomes a potential, right? So in the same way, the consciousness of the soul, when it's focused, when it's present within the body, then the harmony of the cellular turnover remains consistent. The mental life of the human, the self-conscious mental life, is a unified experience, even though there's so much difference within that unity. So for me, that's where the evidence of the soul comes from, and heaven or hell or whatever else, those are, in the Vedic view, those are all understood as different planes of consciousness. So the details of those planes of consciousness is a little arbitrary for this kind of discussion, but the fact that it's a matter of the conscious experience of an observer, and the transition, the question of death is, what is the experience of that observer when it's no longer localized or connected with a physical body? Because our direct experience, our whole practice of science or religion or philosophy, is always connected with this experience as an observer. So we know from a third party perspective that when someone dies that's not us, we can't talk to them anymore, but we have no experience of what it is firsthand to experience death, of course, until it occurs. So to just assume that that first person experience disappears is as much, conjecture as the next theory. So I find that it may help our understanding of biology to posit that there is an orchestrator, and maybe that will help answer questions that have not yet been answered, harmonizing the organismic level of organization with cellular levels of organization or tissues, and how the organism and the environment interact in a interpenetrating way. I think that if we acknowledge that there is a real self, which is the organism as a whole, self or soul, I think it opens up a lot more comprehensive understanding of nature itself, what to speak of supernatural, what happens after life.
The self idea is interesting because, of course, the problem with the Philharmonic Orchestra is that imagining that you have partaking musicians, all of whom come in then when they're young and are moved up when they die, and that relates to what you described as cellular turnover, but that's a trap. Most cells don't turn over. Cells in the liver do, and indeed, the concept of apoptosis, as opposed to mitosis, the mitosis being the process by which cells are generated, and apoptosis being the process by which dead cells are removed. Apoptosis has not been properly appreciated in previous decades and is only now being more widely understood. But not all cells do undergo apoptosis. The neurons in the brain, in which reside most of our memories, not all, plenty reside in the body, but many of the cells in the body, like those in the heart and those in the brain, remain for the life of the entire organism. And there is no need to hand over memory, as it were, from one generation of cells to the next. Many cells do not replicate. Once formed, they remain. The neurons in the brain, for example, are formed very early in life, and their number slowly deteriorates and goes down steadily throughout life. People have said that that's a reason to explain dementia, but of course it doesn't explain it because not everybody becomes demented. There are plenty of sites online that will say, well, if you exercise your brain, you'll avoid dementia. But then you have to think of the people who died of dementia, including people like, say, Margaret Thatcher and Terry Pratchett, people with enormously diverse and active brains. But no, there is no actual cell turnover, except in parts of the body. But in much of the body, the cells that you die with are the actual physical same cells as those that you're born with. I'm so often seeing people online saying, oh, you have a new heart every fortnight. But no, it doesn't work like that. And we are well aware from studies of the examples I showed in my talk, the example, for example, of a very lowly red alga, which actually demonstrates unmistakable levels of intelligence. And cells can certainly memorize. There have been research results published in the last decade or two of microbe memory. And all that humans do is to magnify and potentiate and amplify the proclivities of things their single cells can do. Everything that we do is also done independently by ourselves, by our cells. Our cells come together to potentiate their abilities and to manifest them through human life. But cells can do all the things that we do. They move like us, they see like us, they detect like us, they reach decisions like us. We are simply rich in resonances of the cells of which we are comprised. And when through some curious mechanism, that holistic, that all-embracing, that sort of bringing together disparate communities of cells into a corporate whole, when that suddenly switches off, a person dies. But of course, their cells don't. And I still find that intriguing.
Well, one question I would have, and then one comment I have. The first question is, how do we know that there isn't cellular turnover in the brain and in other parts? I mean, have there been studies that demonstrate that it's exactly the same cells? How do we know that? That's my question. And my comment is, I would be very skeptical to say that cells do the exact same activity that humans do. I mean, right? What makes humans stand apart from all living entities, even in the animal kingdom, is the capacity for self-inquiry, self-reflection, right? I don't think that cells have the capacity to wonder, who am I, why am I here, what is my purpose? I think, of course, they're cognitive and they make decisions on a smaller scale, and they have capacity for cooperation and problem solving within the scope of their cellular life. But I don't think it comes anywhere close to the capacity for self-reflective awareness that a human being has. And this capacity for self-reflective awareness, demarcating what makes humans different from the rest of the living kingdom, is something that philosophers have recognized both in the Eastern and Western world for a long time.
Very interesting, though, if you actually have a mirror and a bear sees itself in a mirror. I can give you another example, and that is that if you take breeds of dogs, they tend to recognize each other. I've never known quite how they do, since they cannot possibly know what they look like. No, the distinction between mankind and non-mankind is very clear, though it's not absolute. there are creatures that do have some sort of sense. No living organism other than a human has the kind of insight that we do. But it stems from what our cells do. Our cells appreciate when they're put into a traumatic or a stressful situation. Our cells can become stressed. Our cells can show distress. If you put a protozoan under very bright light and it, as it were, darts around trying to escape from the bright light, it is stressed, it is anxious. Now, it's not going to sort of sit down to itself in the crossword puzzle solving sense and reflect on the destiny that faces it and reflect on what it might do. But nonetheless, what we do is built upon what our cells do. If our cells could do it, they'd do it. But for example, take something like a redwood tree in California, 350 foot tall. Inside each of its leaves are perhaps 10,000 cells. Inside each of those cells are perhaps 10 or 12 chloroplasts. Now, those chloroplasts were originally independent algae. They developed, they evolved from chlorophyte algae that lived free living in water. And so I could look at a tree, not as a tree, but as algae that have come together and realize that they can get protection by living inside a cell, that the cell can now capture solar energy because it has chlorophyte algae inside it, which we now call chloroplast. So in essence, that 350-foot tree is an algal's way. It is the way of a single-celled alga, which can now live towering 350 feet above the countryside, which if it lived on its own, it couldn't. It's still an alga. It's still doing what algae do, but because it has come together and coordinated, it can transcend its natural environment and achieve things that on their own they couldn't do. And in the same way, cells, by coming together, allow us to review ourselves, to consider ourselves, to reflect upon ourselves, to recognize ourselves, to debate among ourselves and between ourselves, which they can't do. But if you watch two chamidomonas, two little chlorophyte cells, you watch two chamidomonas in the fall swimming towards each other and swimming around, they're eyeing each other up. Do they actually want to fuse? When they decide to fuse, they do. They fuse together. And they have decided to fuse together. Now, it's very difficult to look at that without understanding that you can see in that fusion of those single cells resonances of how we relate to ourselves as human beings. We do it on a grander scale, of course, but the essence of it lies in those single cells. And that is what I do want people to understand, that our nature doesn't just reside in ourselves, but results from the bringing together of the energies and potentialities of all those cells, which between themselves can achieve things which they couldn't on their own. But what they're achieving is fundamentally reflected in how we are. We don't invent things, we potentiate things because of the single cells of which we are comprised.
And of course, your microscopy and your work showing these things about how the cells are courting each other before they merge and all that is very amazing, and I appreciate your work very much in that regard. But it seems to me just, I don't see the necessity behind thinking that it's the lower capacity, the lower cognitive capacity of the cells that gives rise to the higher capacity, cognitive capacity of an organism. I don't see the necessity of thinking like that, because how does something more perfect and more capable come from something less capable? I think rather it's more rational to think that something which is less capable comes out of something which has the broader capacity, so that these cells, they have these capacities for decision making and all of that because they're a part of something beyond themselves which has that quality to a higher degree, and that rather they possess that quality to a lower degree because they're participating in this broader whole. That seems more reasonable than thinking that a smaller, lesser capacity gives rise to a capacity which is greater and which just kind of magically emerges without any real explanation how this greater capacity, this broader quality can actually come from a smaller thing, but it's pretty straightforward how a lesser quality can come out of something which is more perfect than itself.
I think the argument is fallacious. After all, a bag of nails, a bunch of bricks, and a bag of cement is not very much on its own, but it will make a home. As a rule, greater comes from the fusion of lesser. From my point of view, the importance of it is to understand where it actually comes from.
But that's a
Humanity is such an extraordinary thing. We cannot just imagine that in some strange way humanity just happened or humanity just evolved. I mean, the fusion of life, the bringing together of organisms explains much about evolution. Darwinian evolution doesn't explain very much. The principle of survival of the fittest is so simple that a child of 10 can grasp it. And indeed, lots of people have written about survival of the fittest as the driver of evolution before Charles Darwin ever essayed us upon the subject himself. But once you understand that single cells are themselves trying to improve their lives, and you can see how single cells come together. For example, diatoms are single cells. There aren't any multi-cell diatoms, but there are some diatoms that continue to live side by side, as we saw in my films, and which by sliding against each other in a coordinated fashion can make the entire colony of diatoms act as though it was an organism. Yet these are each single cells. On their own, they can't do it. They come together and cooperate, and they can. It's when you see sites like that that you realize that this is how, by coming together and acting in concert, that single cells can achieve things that on their own they couldn't. And the greatest achievement of single cells is to stay united, to create an inner sea in which cell, after all, the first life evolved in the sea, and every cell in your body is still existing in the salt water that is your own inner ocean. And the very fact that cells can decide to create their own ocean and carry it with them and write books, make television programs, and give lectures is something they couldn't do on their own. But by coming together, they can make something far greater out of something that's almost infinitely smaller and lesser.
Returning to what you said before the diatoms about putting the bricks or the concrete together, and so there are two different kinds of wholes that we find, though, right? An aggregate is a mechanical whole, where the whole is just simply the sum of the parts, where they have no internal relationship, and the parts are brought together by an external agency, such as a house or a clock. But that's not the only kind of whole that we find in nature, right? An organism is a whole which the parts are intrinsically connected with each other, and they grow together in an interdependent way, not from an external agency bringing them together, but from an internal agency which is guiding their development to its final manifestation. So the difference between a mechanical whole and an organic whole, these two can't be conflated, and they're ontologically two distinct categories, and this is something that we can thank Immanuel Kant for introducing, and Hegel developed this. But so when we're talking about biological phenomena, we're not talking about mechanical wholes, because it's never an external assembly of parts which are indifferent to each other.
No, it assembles itself. By the way, I didn't answer your very pertinent query earlier about neurons. We know that neurons stay the same because they become so specialized as they develop that they lose the ability to divide. Neurons are a stem cell is a very, very simple cell and can specialize depending on what the cells around it are telling it to do, can develop into almost any kind of cell in the body. But cells like neurons and muscle cells are so incredibly specialized. In my book, which is called Microbe Power, Tomorrow's Revolution, and was published 50 years ago, I pointed out how you can actually look at a single cell in terms of what it does. And then you can amplify each one so that you can say that, for example, cells have the capacity for movement, but muscle cells develop only that capacity and drop everything else. Cells have the capacity for limited thought. Brain cells develop that capacity until that's all the brain cell can do. It can't do anything else. It can't even divide. All it can do is just think. But cells still remain autonomous. If you think back to aspects of the films that I showed you in my presentation, you can look at a droplet of pond water, and there you'll find an amoeba. You can watch it purposefully searching around, looking for food, making decisions as to what it's going to eat and what it isn't, and living its own little life. It's just a little creature. Anybody faced with a video of it who'd never seen a microbe in their lives before would know what it was. But then you can look at a human white cell from your blood, and there it is. It is an amoeba. It is nosing around. It is looking for pathogens. It is trying to find invaders. It is looking for something non-self. And if it finds bacteria or pathogens or parasites, it will inactivate the parasite. It will devour it, consume it, envelop it, and digest it. Now, that little cell is responsible for your health being maintained. The fact that it's always on the lookout for pathogens and always keeping you free from pathogens as far as it possibly can. And yet, that little amoeba, that little white cell, it is indifferent to the brain. The brain doesn't know it's there. The cell doesn't know the brain is there. They have no connection, not connected by nerves, not related to by our emotions or by anything else in our body, not affected by hormones. It is entirely autonomous. It lives its own little life, but within a regulated community. And so, in essence, you can either look at the single cell that remains a single cell and floats off in the pond like an amoeba and just squiddles around looking for little things to eat. But the same cell, if it decides that it's going to evolve into a human, the same human population of cells can produce identical amoebae that nibble around inside our bodies and pick up bacteria and keep us free from disease. But that cell, although it is a regulated part of our body, it's regulated from within. It's part of a community. Nothing outside is controlling it. It works out purposefully for itself what to do. And that thought is an astonishing, astonishing reflection on humanity and what we really are.
But there still seems to be a context within this self-assembly of these single cells, because they have to get the information that informs their development from somewhere, because they stop, right? The fact that cells know when to stop, that they know what a kidney is supposed to be, that they know what any organ or limb is supposed to be, and they know when to stop when they hit that goal. This is information that they're getting from somewhere beyond just this new collective, which is developing through their interactions with each other. They're pulling on a history or a context, some formal principle, which is then promoting their development to a very specific predetermined goal. It's not that the collective can become anything at once. The collective is always becoming, it's achieving a predetermined goal consistently, which exists before that collective even manifested out of, the mitosis of the fertilized egg. It's always, they're achieving the same goal. So the collective isn't just completely autonomous. They can't become anything they want. They're autonomous to the extent that they can achieve that predetermined goal in a way that allows them to overcome unforeseen circumstances, which is amazing. But nonetheless, it's a predetermined goal.
They do achieve autonomy, indeed. And the whole point about the diverse and disparate community of cells that makes up a human is they were all the same cell once. That zygote knows what it's going to do. Whenever you see dividing zygotes on TV, they're always computer graphic models. They're like tennis balls that pop into two tennis balls, and then into 4 and 8 and 16 and 32 and so forth. But if you look at time lapse of an actual dividing zygote, nothing like that. The cells don't simply divide equally. They divide at an angle in specific ways because already they're moving towards how the body is going to develop. And the philosophy of how the developing cells know what their destiny is an extraordinary area to explore. We know, for example, that we often speak of the perfection of the human body, but the human body is terribly poorly laid out. It just shows what happens if you allow cells to evolve themselves instead of having some controlling agency looking after it. The retina in your eye, for example, is inside out. We're all looking at the world through the network of nerves and blood vessels, capillaries, nerve fibers that really ought to be behind the retina and picking up signals from the retinal cells and carrying to the brain. But because of the way in which the body incurves and invaginates when the embryo is developing, because of that, you end up with the retina upside down and covered with the network of fibers. We're looking through a network of nerve fibers and blood vessels. We could see 100 times more clearly if it wasn't for that. Many aspects of our body. The fact that we walk upright, and 90% of us, when we're old, have an aching back because we were never meant to stand upright. There are so many ways in which the body is really badly put together, and that's because the cells, in their own little celly way, worked out how they were going to specialize and form a way of carrying a bit of the ocean around the world and doing things on their own they couldn't do. They haven't done a perfect job. After all, humans are incredibly vulnerable. Quite how we ever evolved to be quite so weak and feeble in a world full of predators, only those rather misguided little cells could ever tell us. Now, we must have done enough time now, wouldn't you think?
Yes, definitely.
If you had other questions, by all means, go ahead. I wouldn't wish to hasten you to an end.
No, I think this is a good place to stop. I would just, I guess, like to say that this kind of discussion, which is trying to hash out what is the interrelation between the cellular level of organization and the organismic level of organization, questions about the self. I think these are all very relevant for productive progress to be made in biology, 21st century biology. And anyhow, so just as so I'd like to end with that this discussion between cellular biology and organismic biology is very productive and it can be very fruitful. And we can close on that. We just have our friend here, Yader Henry, who's a part of our club, who just got out of the lab. So Yader, we're about to finish up, but I'd just like to introduce you to Professor Ford. We recorded our conversation here, and Professor Ford has provided us a video as well, a lecture that he gave. So we're going to upload those to the Science of Life Club YouTube channel, the Bhakti Vedanta Institute YouTube channel, which has a playlist for Science of Life Club.
I have to say, you have the makings of a great scholar of philosophy. I don't often meet young scholars who are as well read and as thoughtful and as deeply philosophical as you are. So I wish you well with that. I hope we'll continue to keep in touch.
Yes.
And it was a pleasure to discuss this with you today.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you for everything.
Yes, I just I'd like to thank my guru, serving director, Dr. Bhaktimadhava Puri. Anything I'm saying, I've learned from his work, the work he's been dedicated to for over 50 years. I'm not getting any of this from my own original thinking. I've learned so much from what he has done, and I'd be nowhere without him. So I just want to say that. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you and goodbye. Namaste.